we move now from talking about culture and society to talking about doctrine. Now, the 19th century was a period of great doctrinal innovation. Not that it was necessarily that the people were more innovative in were not innovative in more previous centuries, but some of the barriers to innovation no longer existed. First of all, you don't have the same kind of power of the clergy and ministers to enforce doctrines and decrees. You have separation of church and state in many places now by this point, and there's a lack of suppressors of heresy that are effective, that are that used to be around in previous centuries. And so not everything that we see here is necessarily innovative or new, but what we do see is the ability to spread ideas and develop new movements and develop new teachings and find adherence that way that perhaps wouldn't have been found in other places. One of the first new so-called ideas in the 19th century was an emphasis on restoring the ancient church. Now, this is sometimes referred to as primitivism because people are trying to find the primitive or original church, not meant to suggest that people that hold this idea are more primitive and culturally primitive, but the idea is that you're going back, you're wanting to find that original church. What was the church like at the time of the apostles? Now, this idea itself is not completely new in some sense. The Catholic Church claimed to be the original church. There's just historical problems with that, but the claim was that they were the original church, so there's no need to restore it because it's still around. Many Protestants during the Reformation also thought of themselves as restoring the apostolic church. Luther, for example, thought of it as that as well. In the late 18th and early 19th century, however, a couple of different strands of thought and philosophy come together here to really develop a new type of movement that will begin spreading throughout America and then the world. One of those first strands that's coming together here is Scottish common sense interpretation. And so this is, we've mentioned Scottish common sense before, but essentially what's going on here is Protestants taking the methods of Francis Bacon and the ideas of the Scottish common sense philosophers and applying them to the Bible. Now, Bacon's method, the Scottish common sense, these were all about the nature of reality, was about the nature of nature, but now Protestants start taking it and applying it to the Bible. The Bible becomes a storehouse of facts, and that you go through and inductively explore to discover the truth. And so, if you wanted to know the truth of something, you looked at all the instances where it was referred to in the Bible and drew out general principles. And so if you wanted to know something about baptism, you would look at all the passages about baptism, and then as you explored those, understood them, you would draw out ideas together and kind of come up with these principles about what baptism was, the mode of baptism, all those kind of things, because you've inductively looked at all the passages related to this. Now, I don't want to suggest that they're talking about the Bible being true and everybody else hasn't. Certainly the Bible has been true for Christians since the very beginning. But what we see here is kind of a new way to approach this idea of truth, or at least a new way to explain truth in the Bible. And, this is not necessarily something that Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries would have said. There's a new way of describing and articulating, how do you approach the Bible and how is the Bible true. A second strand developing in this time period is this kind of rejection of creeds and traditions, especially traditions that don't have a foundation in the Bible. Now, Protestants had expressed similar ideas about tradition and had rejected the historicity of some creeds, like the Apostles' Creed, and essentially said, these statements don't appear to have come from the apostles. Now, while these confessions, creeds, statements of faith might not have originally intended to be comprehensive, although probably some of them were meant to be, by the 19th century, they were used as the standard by which it was told whether you were Orthodox or not. So for Presbyterians, how well you measured up against the Westminster Confession of Faith said much about who you were as a minister for a lot of Presbyterians. And if you held beliefs that were in contrast to the Westminster Confession, you would not be ordained, or you would be ordained, and if you were already ordained, you would be removed from your spot, removed from your ministry. Others in the 19th century were concerned because they did not always accept everything that was found in these creeds, nor did they really like the fact that the creed often bared heavier weight than the Bible, and so there's kind of anti-creedalism. A third strand was a negative approach to biblical silence. We talked during the Reformation period about different approaches to when the Bible doesn't say something about a subject. And ultimately, we mentioned that Ulrich Zwingli's approach to all this was a negative approach. If it's not explicitly addressed in Scripture, it is forbidden. Now, Zwingli himself had a variety of ways that he got around that with things like infant baptism, but in general, that's the principle. And this principle, of course, becomes very important for the restorationists. A fourth strand was kind of an anti-elitism and an emphasis on individualism. Many of those components, the anti-creedalism, Scottish common sense, and the negative approach to biblical silence, these had developed in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, but the anti-elitism really flowers in America after the Revolution. Frustration with and denigration of the educated elite clergy or ministers was expressed throughout the United States in the wake of the Reformation. In the wake of the Revolution, in the early Republic, this period right after the Revolution, there were many who began to reject the idea that Christian ministers needed to be educated at a university or needed to be licensed by a denominational ministry or authority to become a minister. Essentially, the belief of a lot of people was anybody could receive a call to ministry. And so, you could be farming one day and minister the next for a lot of groups. And so people become convinced that the individual is kind of the sole source of authority. You can read and interpret the Bible for yourself. You don't need a minister to explain it to you. Now, while the reformers emphasized the need for interpreting Scripture in the context of the Christian community in order to make sure that it was interpreted properly, by the 19th century, this was largely abandoned by a lot of people in the United States. The final strand that I want to emphasize in this growing restoration of the time is that here people are coming into the United States. And they're seeing all sorts of different forms of Christianity, new groups, but there's a lot of confusion and fracturing of Christianity as well. More and more people tried to overcome this fracturing, this confusion, and wanted to find ways to work across denominational lines. How can we cooperate together? And, eventually some people become convinced that it's denominational lines and labels that are part of the problem. Is because we identify ourselves as Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians. That's part of the problem why we continue to fracture, is that we're these different groups of Christians instead of all together Christians. So this is the context in both Europe and the United States when Thomas Campbell writes a document publishes a document in 1809 called Declaration and Address, published for the Christian Association of Washington, Pennsylvania in 1809. And one of the famous lines from that document is, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. And now that we have some of this context, of course, we can see what that means, and how that is shaped by a lot of the other things that we just got done talking about. Campbell was a Scots-Irish, Old Light, anti-burgher, seceder Presbyterian. He wasn't just a Presbyterian, he was a seceder Presbyterian. He wasn't just a seceder Presbyterian, he was an anti-burgher, seceder Presbyterian, and an Old Light one at that. All right, well, we're not going to have time to go into all this, but essentially a seceder Presbyterian referred to the belief of whether or not churches should select their own ministers. Seceder Presbyterians left, seceded, because they believed that the church should be able to, the local church should be able to hire its own ministers, call its own ministers. Anti-burgher had to do with the regions in Scotland swearing oaths to the established church. Anti-burghers, a burgher was kind of like a mayor, did not like this idea of swearing to a specific church. And then Old Light meant that he followed the traditional interpretations of the Westminster Confession of Faith. But you see how it's no surprise that Campbell becomes very antagonistic to the use of denominational names. I mean, this is all his background. He and later his son Alexander kind of takes over for Campbell, or really comes to the prominency in this movement. Later they would push for a return to apostolic Christianity. And a lot of it was based off of this, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible is silent, we're silent. So it's, you know, based on a lot of the things we just got done talking about, as well as this desire to unify believers who would abandon their denominational allegiances for this simple Christianity that they were promoting. And in one sense, there was some success in that. There was a man named Barton W. Stone, who we'll talk about more in the practice lecture, who was a Kentucky Presbyterian, who also had some similar ideas to the Campbells. And eventually these two movements, the one connected with Campbell, one connected with Stone, merged together. And for some time, the group was successful, eventually becoming the 4th or 5th largest religious group in the United States, and then developed in England and elsewhere. But this unity that was desired eventually started to fracture. Alexander was pugnacious, and he often was very mean toward his enemies. His enemies responded in kind. There were differences in the movement over what does "where the Bible is silent, we are silent" mean. It seems straightforward, but what does that really mean once you start breaking that down? There were differences over theology, societies for the support of missions, class issues, and eventually liberal theologies. The group cannot hold together. Eventually they break into two, between the disciples of Christ, which is Campbell's preferred name, and the churches of Christ, which is coming more from the Stone movement, although certainly heavily influenced by the Campbell movement as well. Now, Campbell looked upon the notion of restorationism, and he thought that the restoration of Christianity, New Testament Christianity, apostolic Christianity, would usher in the millennium. Now, like other 19th century Christians, Campbell believed that human effort and progress was going to bring about a great period of peace and prosperity, and that it would be connected with the kingdom of God on earth. Now, Campbell often had different ideas about what the kingdom was compared to some other Christians at the time. But this notion of optimism. But not everybody who was interested in the coming kingdom looked at it as optimistically. And people had different ways to think about what is coming at the end of the world. Some even attempted to calculate the second coming. One of the most famous in the 19th century was a man named William Miller. William Miller was born an uneducated farmer at the end of the 18th century, and if you had asked him, he mostly would have placed himself as a deist until he fought in the War of 1812, and not surprisingly, war changes a lot of things. and changed Miller as well. And so he eventually joins a Calvinistic Baptist church where he begins to study, largely studying on his own. He wants to focus on his own kind of study, but he's particularly becoming interested in books like Daniel and Revelation, which he's not hearing too much teaching on. But he's also, he also kind of has this idea that the message of Daniel and Revelation is something that could be and should be accessible to all Christians. And with his own study in 1818, he becomes convinced that the message of Daniel and Revelation that people should be able to understand is that the second coming is imminent. It is getting ready to take place. And by 1818, he believed that he discovered the date. But for several years, he doesn't really say anything about the date to too many people. In 1831, though, he starts lecturing, becomes a Baptist preacher, and for several years, he's still not talking much about his beliefs. But finally, in 1831, he starts, in 1836, he starts promoting his views. Writes a book, eventually writes a journal as well. And in it, he starts to kind of lay out how he has come to the conclusion of when the second coming will take place. Now, here's how he worked it out. So one of the key passages for Miller to start with is Daniel 8:14. In Daniel 8:14, it says there will be 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Now, for Miller, he understands the sanctuary to be referring to earth. The earth is going to be cleansed. But how is the earth going to be cleansed? Well, looking at passages, he ultimately came to the conclusion that the cleansing of earth must refer to the second coming. But it certainly wasn't 2,300 days from the time of Daniel to the second coming. So that must mean that the 2,300 days aren't really days. And looking at other passages and other ideas and thinking about it for a while, Miller comes to the conclusion that this must be the attempt by many prophets to refer to years in terms of days. And so sometimes one day equals 1 year. So 2,300 days really means 2,300 years. There will be 2,300 years from that time to the second coming. He then looks at Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, we have the prophecy of the 70 weeks. There would be 70 weeks to prepare for the Messiah from the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Well, when is Jerusalem rebuilt? What's the starting date here? What do we use to begin with to figure out 2,300 years from what? Well, and he looks at this prophecy of the 70 weeks and says, right, here's the position, right, that it would be 69 weeks, is what Daniel was told, to the Messiah from the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And Jesus, of course, is the Messiah that Daniel is prophesying. So weeks can't be weeks. So there would be 483 years to the Messiah. The Messiah would prophesy for a week, and of course Jesus prophesied for 3.5 years. And so doing your calculations, the order to rebuild Jerusalem coming from Artaxerxes to Ezra ends up being 457 BCE, according to this timetable. And then so we subtract 2,300, at the times of the cleansing of the sanctuary, from the rebuilding of the temple, coming up with 1,843 years. Or not, it would come out to the year 1843. Sorry. That's what I meant here. Now, there's no year zero here, of course, and so Miller said it could be anywhere between 1843 and 1844. And because this is a Jewish prophecy, he said, well, you have to use the Jewish New Year, and so that runs from March 21st, 1843 through March 21st, 1844. Sometime in that time period, particularly possible on the 21st of March in either end, the Lord is going to return. The second coming of the Lord will occur. And the movement spread from New England to Ohio to Washington, D.C. There are, people following Miller. In fact, it almost gets to the point where Miller has almost started a new denomination from this. But the year passes and Jesus doesn't return. And so in May of 1844, Miller is thinking about all this and says, he must have made a mistake somewhere. He's confident about certain passages, but there must be something that he's not thought about. And, he seems on the verge of abandoning all of this because he just can't seem to make the math work. But not everybody that had followed Miller is completely convinced to abandon the movement. And a lot of people did. Right? When nothing happened, a lot of people left the Miller movement. But others, however, are not so quick to leave. And so the assumption is 1844 is the right year. We just must have been wrong about the March 21st date. In fact, it shouldn't be the New Year, they argued. It should be Yom Kippur of 1844, because Yom Kippur is the day in which the high priest would go into the temple, into the holiest place of the temple, and sanctify it and cleanse it, right? Spread the blood around. And so the assumption is, we need Yom Kippur of 1844. And so, a minority of Jews observed Yom Kippur on October 22nd of 1844, and so that's kind of held up as the date that is going to take place. Finally, the Lord is going to return. But, of course, the Lord does not return. It too passes without the second coming, as it's been referred to as the Great Divorce. And so a lot of people leave Miller. A lot of people abandon him and his teaching and move on with their lives. But, and even Miller himself, he kind of gives up on some of these ideas. But, when he dies 5 years later in 1849, he's still convinced that the second coming is going to happen soon, right? That this is something that would shortly take place, even though it would be after his lifetime. But not everybody completely abandons his views, even though they've been wrong now 3 times. There's still some people holding on. So they take this notion of the Adventist doctrine, the Advent, or the coming of Christ, the appearance of Christ. They take this Adventist doctrine and reinterpret it and add other components. One approach was to reinterpret what happened in 1844. Miller was right about the time, they said, but he was wrong about what happened and where it would take place. Instead of something happening on earth, something had happened in heaven. The sanctuary in heaven was the focus of Daniel chapter 8. Jesus, they said, had been pleading with God for forgiveness from the time of his ascension to 1844, but now things had taken place where Jesus was blotting out sin in the Holy of Holies. He had finally become the priest of the high priest of the heavenly missionary. To this, they added Sabbatarianism, which meant worship on the seventh day, observing the old Jewish Sabbath. Hence the group being called Seventh-day Adventists. And so individuals like Joseph Bates, James, and Ellen White, help us usher this in by reinterpreting Miller and then adding some components as well. Ellen received visions, according to the claims, which confirmed many of the doctrines, including, worshiping on the seventh day. They argued that Sunday worship was the mark of the beast and had been developed by Catholics. Historically doesn't seem to support that idea. And, Sunday worship appears very early among followers of Jesus, which makes sense because Jesus has risen from the dead on the first day of the week. And so it's no surprise that they've moved on to to worship on Sunday instead of something on the Sabbath. But the assumption is by Seventh-day Adventists, Sunday worship was the mark of the beast, creation of Catholics. They also believed in conditional immortality. When people die, they're unconscious, they're soul sleep, and when God raises them, they are given immortality. The unrighteous will be raised, punished, and then annihilated. Also very important for this burgeoning Seventh-day Adventist movement is health and hygiene. No alcohol, no smoking, follow the Levitical laws about food found in the book of Leviticus. Many Seventh-day Adventists will get involved with hospitals. Many hospitals will, especially in bigger cities, will connect themselves with, many Seventh-day Adventists will open hospitals, and as an expression of this concern about health. One of the first is the Western Health Reform Institute, created in Battle Creek, Michigan, which attracted a lot of people who were interested in health issues but had been largely poorly trained. One of the medical doctors at Battle Creek sought to provide an alternative to bacon and eggs and other unclean breakfast foods. This is something he was really concerned about. And so what he did was discover a way to cook grains and then take those grains and make them into these dry flakes that could be eaten for breakfast. And it's actually John Harvey Kellogg's brother, William Keith Kellogg, who takes this idea and runs with it. Of course, you get Kellogg's comes from this. But also one of Kellogg's patients, C.W. Post, who created Post cereal, also takes a similar type of idea.